So, I took this house-sitting job thinking it was going to be easy money. Just me, a cozy house, and 4 cats. I'd done this sort of thing a dozen times. Feed the pets, water the plants, lock up at night. Nothing too wild. But the moment I stepped inside that house, something felt strange. I remember standing in the hallway, just looking around. The light was dim, like they'd only left a couple of lamps on, and the shadows were stretching across the walls in a way that made everything seem quieter, almost too quiet. I can't quite explain it, but the air felt heavy, like the house was pressing down on me, watching me somehow. But I told myself it was just nerves. New place, alone, a little creepy, sure, but that was normal, right? I went over the list they'd left for me, and I realized they'd written a lot of very specific instructions. I remember thinking it was weird that they'd made a big deal about keeping the cats inside certain rooms, locking certain doors, and making sure food was always put away. But hey, it's their house, their rules. I figured maybe they just loved those cats a little too much. Still, as I walked around, getting used to the place, I couldn't shake this feeling, like someone, or something, was there with me. Every little creak, every quiet shuffle made me jump. I kept telling myself it was just an old house settling, that my mind was playing tricks, but have you ever been alone somewhere and heard a sound you couldn't explain? Yeah, that was me, just barely an hour in. If you're wondering where this is going, all I can say is, you might want to stick around. It only got stranger from there. Once I was inside and started getting settled, I figured I'd check the whole place out, just to get familiar with where I'd be staying. I told myself it was all just nerves, a little weirdness that would go away once I'd had a chance to look around. So, I went from room to room, flipping on lights, opening doors, kind of talking myself down. It was a big, old house, creaky, with a lot of wood and these long hallways that seemed to stretch a little too far. At first, it was normal enough. The living room was cozy, with all this vintage furniture that looked like it had been there forever. The kitchen was spotless, almost too spotless, like nobody had cooked a meal in there for years. Then there was the study, a room they'd specifically told me to keep the cats out of. I didn't know why, but maybe they had valuable stuff in there, old books and photos, stuff like that. I shut the door and tried not to think too much about it. I moved on to the rest of the house, checking each room and getting a feel for the place. But then I started hearing these sounds. It was faint, like something you'd think you imagined. At first, it sounded like whispering, just a soft murmur coming from, well, somewhere. I'd stop, listen, and then, nothing. Silence. I'd laugh it off, tell myself it was just an old house settling or maybe something outside. But then, as I moved down the hallway, I started hearing it again, this time, more like a faint crying sound, drifting down from somewhere upstairs. I stopped in my tracks. My heart was racing, and I could feel that familiar prickling on the back of my neck. I tried to laugh it off, but every step I took made me feel more on edge. I was talking to myself, muttering things like, "It's just a big, old house, nothing to worry about." But honestly, I wasn't buying it. I didn't believe it for a second. So I went up the stairs, each one creaking louder than the last, and the noise seemed to fade the closer I got to the top. I thought maybe I'd find something there, maybe a window left open, or some kind of draft making those sounds. But when I reached the landing, nothing. Silence again. Just me and the shadows stretching down the hallway. The whole place felt like it was watching me, waiting. I know that sounds dramatic, but if you've ever been somewhere alone and heard sounds like that, you know what I mean. It messes with you, makes you question every little noise and shadow. If you were there, what would you have done? Would you just brush it off, or go looking for the source? Let me know in the comments. Anyway, I told myself it was time to get back to business, to shake it off. But I had no idea how much more was coming. As I was getting settled, I started hearing this sound. At first, it was so faint I thought maybe I was just imagining things. But it kept going, this soft little noise, almost like someone was crying. I remember standing there in the hallway, holding my breath, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The more I listened, the more I realized it sounded like a baby crying. That didn't make any sense at all. There was no reason for a baby to be in this house. No one was supposed to be here except for me and the cats, and yet, there it was, this soft, steady whimpering that seemed to drift up from somewhere below. I started to move, slowly, listening for any hint of where it could be coming from. It seemed to shift with every step I took, just out of reach, but I finally pinpointed it. It was coming from the basement. My mind was racing with questions. Why would I be hearing a baby down there? I kept thinking, maybe I missed something, maybe the family didn't tell me everything, but what if somehow, some way, a child had been left down there? I had to know. So, I took a deep breath, stepped forward, and reached out for the basement door. My hand was shaking, and I could feel my pulse pounding as I gripped the knob. Every instinct was telling me to turn around and forget about it, but the crying got just a little louder, like it was urging me forward. When I opened the door, the darkness below felt heavy, like it was just waiting. I hit the light switch, and this dim bulb flickered on at the bottom of the stairs, casting these long, strange shadows across the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was down there, something just beyond where I could see. But I told myself it was all in my head, just nerves, so I started down, step by step, clutching the railing. Every stair creaked, every sound seemed to echo, blending with that faint crying noise that was still lingering, just barely there. When I finally reached the bottom, the air was cold and damp, making me shiver. I looked around, trying to spot where the noise was coming from, but all I saw was one of the cats, the youngest one, a small gray tabby, stuck inside a storage room. Its eyes caught the light, and it pawed at the door, like it wanted me to open it. I felt this wave of relief wash over me, and I actually laughed. It had to be the cat making those sounds, right? My mind had twisted it into something else because I was already on edge. I was being ridiculous. I opened the door, let the little cat out, and watched it sprint back up the stairs, leaving me alone in the basement. Just as I turned to follow, though, I saw something. A movement in the corner of my eye, just there in the shadows. I froze, heart pounding, staring into that dark corner, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I couldn't tell if it was a person, a shadow, or just a trick of the light, but for a split second, it looked like something was there, something watching. The basement was quiet again, but that eerie feeling crept back over me. I couldn't be sure if it was real or just my imagination. Should I have stayed down there and tried to figure it out, or should I have turned around and left the house right then and there? If you were in my place, what would you do? Would you investigate or get out while you still could? Let me know in the comments. But for me, that was only the beginning. The next day, I felt a little better. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the whole basement thing had been nothing more than a weird first night jitters kind of thing. By the time my boyfriend came over later that afternoon, I'd almost managed to shake off the whole incident. We were standing in the kitchen, just chatting, when I heard it again. That same sound, a cry, faint but growing louder, like it was coming from right there with us. I froze, trying to place where it was coming from, and when my boyfriend heard it too, we both stopped talking and just looked at each other, unsure if we were really hearing what we thought we were. This time, it sounded like it was coming from a cabinet. Right there in the kitchen. My boyfriend gave me this look, like, "Are you hearing this, too?" And I nodded. I was hearing it, all right. We both stood there, just staring at the cabinet, not really sure if we should go near it or get out of there. But we couldn't just ignore it, so we crept over, inch by inch, until we were right in front of it. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, and I could feel my boyfriend tense up beside me. With a shaky hand, I reached for the cabinet handle, half expecting to find some kind of animal or, honestly, I didn't know what I was expecting. But I wasn't expecting a man. Yes, a man was actually crouched there, hidden inside the cabinet. He was pressed back into the shadows, his eyes wide as he looked up at us, and he held up his hands like he didn't want any trouble. My boyfriend and I both jumped back, shocked, barely able to process what we were seeing. The man slowly climbed out, his clothes dirty and worn, like he'd been hiding there for a while. He looked older, maybe in his 50s, with a rough, tired look about him. He raised his hands in front of him, trying to calm us down as he stammered out an explanation. He told us he used to work for the family as a gardener. He said they'd fired him recently, and he felt it wasn't fair, that he'd worked there for years and they'd just let him go. He didn't have anywhere to go, he said, so he'd been hiding in the house, sneaking food here and there. I stood there, just staring at him, trying to wrap my head around what he was telling us. He seemed nervous, fidgeting with his hands, shifting his eyes between us, as if he was worried we were going to call the police or something. My boyfriend was visibly unsettled, and I didn't blame him, I was too. This was supposed to be an easy job, just me and some cats. Now we had a stranger in front of us, who'd apparently been sneaking around in the house, listening to us, and hiding in places I'd been passing by all along. I couldn't shake the feeling of how close he'd been this whole time, maybe even watching me from the shadows without me knowing. Just the thought of it made me feel cold. And while he seemed harmless enough, just a man down on his luck, there was something about the way he looked at us that felt strange. I looked at my boyfriend, not sure what to say. Should we let him stay, or was this the moment to call someone? It was unsettling knowing he'd been here without anyone's knowledge. But then again, he wasn't threatening us. He seemed desperate more than anything. Have you ever come across a stranger somewhere you never expected to find them? It's a feeling I can't quite describe. Let me know if you've ever had anything like this happen. But this was only the start of things getting really strange. After a few tense moments, my boyfriend and I managed to lock the man in the kitchen. We quickly called the police, explaining that someone had broken in and was hiding in the house. It felt surreal, even as I was saying it. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting him to somehow be right behind me. But no, he was still in there, just quiet, and I could only imagine him sitting in the dark, waiting. When the police arrived, my boyfriend and I both felt a wave of relief, like finally, someone was here to deal with this. I remember standing in the hallway, clutching my phone, watching as two officers stepped inside, looking serious but calm. They listened carefully as we told them everything, nodding as if they'd dealt with things like this before, which somehow made it feel a little less terrifying. The officers motioned for us to stay back while they went to handle the man. We followed a few steps behind, my boyfriend's hand gripping my shoulder as if to keep me steady. I could feel my heart pounding again as we moved toward the kitchen door, the silence pressing in on us. The house, which had already felt strange before, now felt almost suffocating. Every step seemed louder than the last, and I couldn't help but notice the officers' expressions getting more serious the closer we got. I could feel the tension building as they reached for the doorknob. One of them glanced back at us, giving a nod as if to reassure us, but I noticed something odd in his expression, maybe a flicker of doubt, or even hesitation. It was almost like he was second-guessing himself, like he was suddenly unsure about what they were about to find. The two officers pushed open the door, stepping into the kitchen while my boyfriend and I held back, peeking in from the hallway. I strained to see over their shoulders, feeling a mix of dread and relief, expecting to see the man there, hopefully calm and ready to be taken away. But as the officers scanned the room, something felt wrong. The kitchen was empty. There was no one there. The room looked the same as we'd left it, with the chairs pushed back, the pantry door slightly ajar, a half-finished glass of water on the counter. But the man was gone. Somehow, he'd disappeared, vanished without a trace, even though we'd locked him in there. One of the officers turned to us, eyebrows raised, and asked if we were sure we'd actually locked the door. My boyfriend and I looked at each other, both of us feeling that strange mix of panic and confusion. Yes, we were sure. We had locked him in, and there was no way he could have just slipped out. The officers exchanged a glance, their faces shifting from calm to a look that was harder to read, like they were realizing this wasn't as simple as they'd thought. One of them asked if there was a back door or a window he might have escaped through, but we both knew there wasn't. I could see my boyfriend was just as disturbed as I was. We were both trying to understand how this man, who we'd seen just moments before, could simply vanish like that. Standing there, with the police in the room, I should have felt safe, but instead, I felt even more on edge, like something was still terribly wrong. The officers started looking around, checking cabinets, even opening the fridge as if he might somehow be hiding in there. But he wasn't anywhere to be found. If you were there, would you feel safe just because the police were there? Would having them around make you feel any better, or would it make you feel even more nervous? Hit the like button if you think you'd feel safer, or leave a comment if you wouldn't. And for me, having the police there didn't ease that creeping fear. I could tell that whatever was going on in that house, it was far from over. With the police there, I thought we'd finally get this whole thing under control. They assured us they'd check every corner of the house if they had to, but I just wanted this to be over. We stood there in the hallway, my boyfriend and I, watching the officers as they moved carefully into the kitchen to take another look. Then one of them stopped, motioning for the other to get ready. He placed his hand on the doorknob, and we all tensed, not sure what they'd find on the other side. The officer glanced back at us, probably noticing our terrified faces, and then gave a small nod, as if trying to reassure us that they had this handled. I wasn't reassured. The officer swung the door open, and in the dim kitchen light, I saw him. He was crouched in the far corner, his head bent low, almost hidden by his arms as he hugged his knees. The way he was sitting was all wrong, like he was trying to make himself as small as possible, pressed into the shadowy corner. My heart skipped, and I felt my boyfriend grip my arm tightly. One of the officers called out to him, telling him to stand up, to come forward slowly. But he didn't respond. He stayed in that crouched position, unmoving, like he didn't hear them at all. Then, he lifted his head. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else, but then he spoke. Only, the sound wasn't coming from where he was crouching. The voice was echoing from somewhere behind us, from the hallway we'd just come through. I could feel my stomach drop, my hands going cold as I spun around, convinced someone else must be standing right behind us. But no one was there. The hallway was empty. I looked back toward the kitchen, heart hammering, just as he raised his face. And that's when I realized, his face wasn't right. There were no features, no eyes, no mouth, nothing. Just this dark, empty void where his face should have been. It was like staring into a bottomless shadow, something so wrong it didn't even feel real. The officers froze, staring, and I could tell they were just as horrified as we were. One of them shouted something, but I couldn't hear it over the ringing in my ears. It was like everything around us had fallen away, the walls closing in, the light flickering in that unsteady way that made shadows jump and dance across the room. I could feel my boyfriend trembling next to me, his hand gripping mine so tightly it hurt, but I didn't let go. I couldn't take my eyes off that horrible, blank face in the corner. The kitchen lights flickered harder, almost stuttering, and I heard this low, buzzing sound start to build in my ears, getting louder and louder until it felt like my whole head was vibrating. I couldn't move. None of us could. I felt like if I looked away for even a second, that blank face would be right in front of me, staring with those hollow, empty eyes that weren't there. And then, just as quickly as it began, the lights flickered one last time and the figure was gone. There was only empty space where he'd been crouching moments before. The officers turned to look at us, wide-eyed and pale, as if they couldn't believe what they'd just seen either. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced with questions, none of them making any sense. My whole body was screaming at me to get out of there, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I was still staring at that empty spot in the corner, half expecting him to reappear, half hoping he wouldn't. If you were in my shoes, would you stay or would you run? Type "run" in the comments if you'd leave right then and there, no questions asked. Because standing there in that silence, I was closer to running than I'd ever been in my life. And I had no idea that this was just the beginning of what was waiting for us in that house. The officers were the first to break the silence. They exchanged uneasy glances, and then one of them murmured something to his partner that I couldn't catch. The only thing I understood was that it was time to leave. My boyfriend squeezed my hand, giving me this terrified look, and I knew he was thinking exactly what I was, that we needed to get out of this house and never come back. But as we turned to go, something strange happened. I felt stuck, like I was moving through thick, invisible mud. My legs felt heavy, my heart pounding, but I couldn't make myself turn away from the kitchen. And as I looked back, I saw that figure again, the faceless man, standing right in the doorway. It was like he'd just appeared, right there, blocking our way out. The officers shouted for us to leave, their voices laced with panic, but none of us could make ourselves move. It was as if we were drawn toward him, like something was pulling us in, forcing us to stand there and watch. My legs were frozen, but my mind was screaming, urging me to break free and run. I knew I had to get out, but my feet felt rooted to the spot, like something invisible was holding me in place. My boyfriend tried to pull me toward the door, his hand gripping mine, but his steps slowed too, his movements becoming sluggish, almost dazed. The officers were trying to turn as well, their faces blank and unfocused, their eyes locked on the faceless figure. Every attempt to move felt like swimming against a strong current, and no matter how hard we tried, we were barely making any progress. The figure's shadow stretched out, slowly spreading across the floor, swallowing the light around it, making the room darker, colder. I could feel my pulse racing, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure everyone else could hear it. I watched as his shadow crept closer, stretching over the officer's boots, inching toward us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that if it touched me, I'd never be able to leave. I don't know what happened next, but something inside me snapped, this surge of pure terror pushing me to fight against whatever was holding me back. I clenched my boyfriend's hand, pulling with everything I had, my legs finally moving as I forced myself to break free. The officers, too, seemed to shake out of their trance, stumbling backward, eyes wide with horror as they realized what was happening. With one last push, we all turned and ran, bolting toward the front door, not even daring to look back. I could feel the darkness pressing in, like it was right behind us, threatening to pull us back at any second. My boyfriend and I practically flew out the door, racing down the steps and into the yard, our breaths coming in panicked gasps as we tore away from that house. Even when we reached the street, we didn't stop running. We didn't look back, didn't check to see if the officers were behind us. We just kept going, our footsteps echoing in the silence of the night, the house growing smaller in the distance, its shadowy windows watching us as we escaped. I don't know how far we ran, but when we finally stopped, panting and gasping for air, I felt this wave of relief, mixed with fear, wash over me. We'd made it out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, that the darkness we'd left behind wasn't as far away as it should have been. If you're still watching this, if you've stayed with me through this whole story, type "escape" in the comments. Let's see who's brave enough to stick around until the end. Because even though we got away, part of me wonders if we really escaped at all. It's been months since that night, but there isn't a single day that goes by without me thinking about what happened in that house. My boyfriend and I decided, right then and there, that we were done with house sitting. I didn't care how easy the money was or how simple the job seemed. There was no way I'd ever step foot in a stranger's home again, not after what we saw. We both tried to tell ourselves that it was over, that we were safe now. But the feeling stayed with us, the sense that what we experienced wasn't something you could just walk away from. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, convinced I'd heard footsteps outside my bedroom door or felt someone standing just at the edge of my bed. My boyfriend would try to comfort me, telling me it was just my imagination, but I could tell he was just as shaken. I would catch him staring into dark corners of our apartment, like he expected to see that faceless figure lurking there. As time went on, I tried to push the memory of that night out of my mind, to convince myself that there had to be some rational explanation for what we saw. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that some things just can't be explained. There's a line between what's real and what isn't, and I felt like we'd crossed it, like we'd stumbled into something we were never meant to understand. Even now, sitting here, I feel like I'm still being watched. Every so often, I catch a shadow moving out of the corner of my eye, Or I hear a strange noise, like whispering just beyond hearing. Maybe it's just in my head. Or maybe whatever was in that house has somehow found a way to follow me. But the scariest part of all? It wasn't the faceless figure, or the whispering, or even the way it felt like we couldn't move, couldn't escape. It was the way that house felt so completely normal when we first arrived. It was just a job, a quick house-sitting gig to make some extra money, nothing out of the ordinary. And somehow, that ordinary setting turned into the most terrifying night of my life. Now, I can't help but wonder how many other houses hold secrets like that one. How many other people have walked into a seemingly normal home, only to find themselves face to face with something that defies everything they know about reality. So, what do you think? Was it all just a strange coincidence, or do you believe there's something out there we can't explain? Have you ever felt like something was watching you, even when you're alone? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you're as drawn to stories like this as I am, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. There are so many stories out there, some of them are almost too terrifying to tell. But if you're brave enough, stick around. There's always more to discover.